Okay, so in the last tutorial, we created a gold material that is sort of a base for our scene or for the object that we're trying to redo, which is this. We're trying to recreate this kind of same luster that Tutankhamun's death mask has. So I'm going to go ahead and, before I was using the interactive render region, I'm just going to go ahead and render a region right now and just render part of his face so that we can kind of get some sense of what this looks like. So the next step is going to be adding that additional detail to the surface of this object. And so we're going to do that in two places. One of the places we're going to do that is clearly the bump channel. We need to adjust the bump and the way that that looks. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can use textures in the reflectance channel to modify different settings. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with that. So you can kind of see the outcome. Now you'll notice there's a lot of noise in here, and that's because I have my render settings set pretty low. So anything in here that should be like a smooth transition is kind of pixelated and noisy. And that's just so that these renders don't take forever to complete. I would say right now, I even want this to be a warmer color than it currently is. And so there's ways that I could do that, but first I want to make sure that we learn how to add some noise to this. Now, I would say materials are something where you can just keep tweaking on them until you get something that you're happy with, and you can continue working forever if you so desire. And so we're going to get it close, and then you can continue tweaking and making changes to it as we go. But so the next channel we need to work with is, we're going to start by going to the bump channel. So I'm going to select the bump channel, turn it on, right? And as we know, nothing happens. I'm going to go back to my interactive renderer, render region, which is hard to say. And I'm going to make this window smaller because really, I want this, I just want to be able to make sure that this is actually working and not taking forever to render. And so right now it is taking forever to render, right? So I want this as small as possible. So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out what texture I want. And you'll see that there's variations on the surface. Some of them are variations in essentially how shiny it is, right? But there's other variations that are really subtle in terms of just the smoothness of the surface. And so we want to use the bump channel to adjust some of those things. And so let's go ahead and we're going to use noise. Noise is a very common thing to use to do this. And if I go with the default settings, you're going to see that it's a little bit overwhelming, the changes that it makes to this surface, right? And it doesn't look great. And there's a couple things going on here. First, the scale is going to be too large for this noise. And second, the type of noise doesn't really make sense. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the global scale. Now, one of the things that here is, if you're making a material and you make it for this little bust that's actually like human scale, and then you apply it to a huge cube, like a 200 centimeters, like default sized cube, it's gonna look really different applied to that material, and all of that is going to be due to the scale, the global scale of the noise that you are using. And so I'm going to go ahead and set this to 25% to start with, and we'll see what happens to the surface now. Right. So now the noise is impacting this surface much more frequently, right? Because these bumps are smaller and closer together. This is closer to what I want, but obviously this is a little bit too intense in terms of the amount that it's changing the surface, right? I want little changes, and even on top of this, I'm going to want some even finer changes. And so the first thing to do is get this base right. Now, this noise might work out, but if I go to if I go to some of my options in here, which if I click on this arrow, There's some other options that may be a little bit nicer for creating a smearing effect if I make some changes to them. And so I'm going to go ahead and choose this Wavy Turbulence. Right? And when I do Wavy Turbulence, you can see that I'm actually already starting to get some of these fine changes right, in some of this, but it's like way too much right now. Right? And so we need to reduce this. And there's a couple ways we can do that. First, we can either use contrast and brightness down here. If I reduce the contrast, right, I'm going to get a more subtle interaction on the surface, right? That's one way to do it. Other times people will actually decrease the contrast by changing these colors to be something more subtle. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce this even more, right? So this is almost just gray, right? It's really close to being gray. And I'm not so worried about the speckling here, right? That's because of the way this is done. But what I'm looking at is what's happening to the edges here, right? There's some smears and things that really look like some of the smearing that happens on the surface of this object. Now, if I go ahead and turn my bump off, we can see what the original looks like, and you can kind of see what changes this is making to this object, right? So it's starting to smear this stuff, and it may still be a little bit intense, but I'm actually pretty happy with the way it's doing things. Maybe I need to make this even less intense, and so maybe what I'll do is I'll pull the brightness up a touch, which will actually kind of raise that surface a little bit. And then I could even reduce this down to, say, negative 88%, right? So I'm getting a very subtle effect on the surface of this. Now, from this base, there are some other, like, finer details on here. And so one of the questions would be like, well, how can I have this really subtle thing and then have something else that's on top of that? To do that, we're going to use what's called a layer shader. And what layer shader does is we click on this arrow, we go down to layer. And what the layer shader does is it takes, if you have another shader already set, it saves all of that. But it creates this ability to create layers of shaders. And so this is the one I just created. In order to get to the settings there, all I do is I click on the little gray square here, and that'll pop me into that shader. I'm going to click the up arrow to go back to the layer shader. And then, so if I want to add another layer, so if I want some other noise to add on to this, I can go ahead and go to shader, and I can go to noise. And now it's going to essentially overlay this one, because it's set to normal, on top of this base. And that's not what I want. In fact, what I'd really like to do is actually copy this shader. So if I select it and hit Command or Control C, Command or Control V, I should be able to paste another layer. Nope. Huh. Why does it not let me do that? Oh, I can just say Copy Shader. I can select this other shader, and I can say Paste Shader. Oh, it actually creates another one. Odd. So I'm going to select the one that I didn't want at all. I'm going to remove that. And these are both the same at this point. But what I want to do is I want to make some adjustments to how this top one works, and then change the way it blends. And so I have the scale here set to 25%. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the contrast so I can see what I'm doing. And then I want to set my global scale to something smaller, like let's just say 5%. And what that's going to do, right, is it's going to create this like super intense smearing of this object on here. And obviously that's not what I want as an end result. But so what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to see if blending it with this other layer helps. So I'm going to go ahead and say overlay to start with. And that looks like it's not going to help me any. Maybe I can try lighten. Again, not really helping. Let's try multiply. Multiply seems better, right? I want this to be more subtle, but again, it's still like way overdoing it, and it's doing it uniformly across the surface. So first, I really want to dial this down a little bit. All right, so I'm going to take my percentage here and reduce it, and just see what happens there. It looks like it's still going to be too much. I'm going to drop that even lower. Right? And so now it's adding a little bit, but it's just adding a hair onto what's already there. Now I could increase this again. Let's go ahead and go back up a little bit. And what I really want to do is I'd like this to be only in certain patches. And so the way I can do that is I can go ahead and create a folder. And I can pull this in and drop it inside that folder. And then if I select the folder again, I can go to shader and I can create another noise shader. And this time what I can do is I can use this to basically make it so it only impacts certain areas. And so if I go to, what would be good? Oh, oops, I'm on the wrong thing. Let's say normal, right, which is just overlaying this. But if I change this noise to multiply, that's not going to help us any. That gets rid of everything. If I change it to overlay, I don't know why it's doing this. So once I have this noise shader, what I can do is I can increase the global scale from 100 to say 400%, because what I'm going to want to use this one for is to block out some of that finer detail effect, right? Right now, if I had this all turned on the way it should be, it would be that fine detail effect that plays over the whole thing. But I can use noise to have regions where it's applied and regions where it's not applied. And so if I increase my low clip and decrease my high clip and increase my contrast significantly, right, I can have these areas where I have high areas of brightness and high areas of darkness. And the other thing that I can do is I can adjust the seed value. And what the seed value does, right, is it changes where things are and where things aren't. And then what I can do is I can use this to mask this effect, whether it's in whether the white comes through or the darker areas come through. And to do that is I use my blend mode. So right now, right, I've got this set to multiply. If I say normal on this, right, when I do that, all that's going to be on here is whatever this is set to, which we had already set. And then it's going to be multiplying this black and white area, right? So we'll have some areas where we're going to get some variation and some areas where we're not. And so what we really want to do is we want to adjust the percentage of that. And we want to change this normal to either screen, right, which is going to be way too much. Right? We can already see that that's problematic. Right? So we just go through until we find something that seems to fit what we're interested in doing. And so you can do luminance. One of the options that might work is layer mask, right? Which didn't unfortunately work at all. Although actually layer mask works there. I think we're going to leave it there just because of time. This is something where, right, as you add layers and you change the way that things are mixing, you can get really significantly more subtle interactions. But I don't want to take forever with this tutorial. It's already too long. So let's go ahead and say we're happy with that. So let's go to Reflectance, and we're just going to look at how we can apply noise there. First, we could apply all of the same noise if we wanted to there. We're going to go ahead and start from scratch, and we're just going to look at one of the layers, particularly the top layer that has the brightest highlights, that are the sharpest, cleanest things that we want to have some variation on. And so one of the things we can do is we can adjust our layer color. We can adjust, which we haven't done yet, right? We left it pretty gold and pretty white. You know, and maybe it's a little bit too bright white and it needs to be a bit more yellow. We could adjust that. But the other things we can do is we can adjust roughness, we can adjust reflection strength, or any of these things by flipping these little things open and adding a texture. And so I'm going to go ahead and add a noise texture to the roughness of this top layer. And what it does is basically from black to white, it goes from the bottom value of your roughness to the top value of your roughness. So if I was to boost this up to say 88%, we should have some areas where it's really sharp and some areas where it's really diffuse. And, you know, you're going to see that in this case, it's, you know, mostly diffuse everywhere. But so what we're going to need to do is we don't really want it to be that rough, but let's say we go to 34%, we go to our noise, and remember, we want this to be scaled appropriately. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to, let's just go 15%, so it's really small. And you can already see what that's doing to the shape of the reflections on the object, right? This was a uniform thing, now it's a bit more split up, and some of these shapes are really changing. And so this noise is really, again, not the best. We did Wavy Turbulence before. You could try something else if you want. You know, dense might be interesting. It's a bit more intense, and so you can see what this does to that surface. As it goes through and warps this, I get a bit more blobbiness on there. I don't know how else to describe that. And so this might actually, just the way it is, might be enough of a change to help add a lot of variation to this surface. Okay. All right, so that's all I did. I could go in and tweak it and make some other changes, but I'm actually pretty happy with the way it looks right now. I'd like there to be some more fine detail in here, but honestly, it's going to take me a fair amount of time to go in there and tweak and adjust things until I'm happy with how they look. And so right, but I feel like we've gotten that basic understanding of how to create this material down. All right, so there's a bunch of settings in here, right? This is a whole world unto itself. I'm going to go ahead and save what I have. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply this to both busts, and I'm going to render the scene. So I'm going to go ahead and pop this on here. And I'm going to go ahead and and I'm just going to render this to the picture viewer. And this is going to take some time. Okay, so after getting this image rendered, you'll notice that there are some things that I'm really happy with, which is, some of the green highlighting around here and the way that these highlights are broken up on the surface. And you'll notice that, right, it's similar to the way these are broken up. The highlights are a little bit bright, and that may just be that the lights need to be further away from the subject. Or I may need to make some other subtle adjustments to make these highlights a little bit smaller. The other things that, one thing I would like it to be a little more warm in color and the green to be a little bit less intense. And so I went through and I made some adjustments. And there's one other thing. These, some of those base colors that make up this gold object are a little bit too smooth. But I don't want them to be as crazy and splotchy as this. If I was to use the exact same noise settings for every layer in my reflectance, what I end up with, I actually have an example here, I think. What I end up with is something like this, where all of those speckles are like all over the place. And it looks honestly really cool, but not what I'm going for, right? It's something that would be really interesting, like if you were trying to make glass that had speckled colors in it. This would be a way to create that effect. Or if you wanted to have multiple, if you wanted to have something where you had like, paint splotches under a glossy finish, this would be a way to do that. It's not a way to make gold that looks real though. However, if you use those same noise settings on each of the layers, but, oops, I did not mean to do that, but you make them much more subtle, then you can have that work. And so so you'll notice here I have this little tiny bit of render that I did that's a lot closer to this, right? The green isn't quite as bright. It's a little bit warmer across the whole body of this. I might still want to bring a bit more yellow in certain areas, but it's getting closer, right? And that's what I want, is something that's close. And so if we look at these other layers, I went ahead and added noise to each one of these, right? To start with, the roughness on this layer is where we added the noise. And so all I did was I went down and I selected this, I said copy shader, and then I pasted the shader into these other layers. And so I pasted it into the roughness channel. And if something is bolded like this, that means that that if you flip this open, there's something there. And so I added the noise, and then I just adjusted it so that the base color, instead of being black, is 85% vibrance, right? So there's 100% for the white and 85 for the black. And what that does is it makes these subtle changes that kind of give that smeary appearance on the surface, but don't make such a radical change in the underlying layers, because we want those to be more even, but not perfectly even. And so, and the other thing is I left the seed value the same on all of these. You could adjust that and see what it looks like, but it might be kind of crazy. It might not look very good at all. So you just have to test and see. The other thing I did is I reduced layer 3's opacity to increased it to 69%. And the color here is 127, 43, and 91.675. So that I made those minor adjustments to make it a little more green, or sorry, a little less intensely green on the surface. And then each one of these, I basically did the same thing. I just sort of honestly, I guesstimated with the noise here. So this one might be, this is 87 instead of 83 or 85. But if they're somewhere in that, mid 80s range, you'll have a similar effect. And so those are the changes I made to make it a little bit closer to this mask. And again, there's a bit more tweaking I would probably do, but that's enough for this tutorial. And something to note, we've talked about interactive render region. Render region just does little parts in the full render settings that you've set. And so I know the forehead and the eyes give me a lot of information. So I can just do this little section here and render this little part right? Which is going to take some time, but it'll give me a lot of information in terms of how effective my new render settings are, right? And so, or my new material settings are. So if I let this finish, and I can see all of these highlights and some of that green on there. And something that's nice, if you make a mistake and you accidentally don't get as much as you'd want, like I need a bit more forehead, what's nice about, oh, there it goes. What's nice about the render region is you can click and drag and it won't get rid of what's already done, it'll add on to it. All right, so if I go ahead and look at my death mask now, and again, with noise, I could go in on the bump channel and make a little bit more change to make some of this happen. But I'm happy with where it is right now. So we've created our own gold from scratch.